Greetings, everybody, and welcome to another game to memorize. This one here is one of the more famous games ever played, I think. It's definitely, there's definitely a chance that you'll have seen some part of it, if not the whole thing. And there's a phase of the game that's very memorable in which will be no trouble to memorize. And then there's two phases that are a little bit harder, so there's a little bit of a challenge to it. Before I show you the game, I just want to mention that Bobby was 13 years old when he played this game against Donald Byrne. I think Donald Byrne was only technically an IM, whereas his brother Robert Byrne was a grandmaster, but Donald was quite a strong player as well. Certainly quite a scalp for a 13-year-old, and you'll see from this game that Bobby was already at a pretty insane level at age 13. If you wondered like how good was this player at this age or that age, this game tells you quite a bit about him. So first we're going to play through the game once with me, just holding back on the comments so you sort of have a sense of the picture and the scope of the game, and then we'll go through it with explanations because, as always, the way to remember a game is to understand it. You need to have a story and an understanding of how the moves play together. Okay, so Byrne's white, knight f3, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, bishop g7, d4, castles, bishop f4, d5. White plays queen b3, takes and takes, c7's attacked, c6. E4 develops, rook in the middle. As Jesse would say, pop. The queen moves out of the way, and Bobby gets the development basically done. I'm not going to explain anything yet, but all right, and now, in a certain sense, the game begins. Boom! My apologies, folks. Before I recorded this video, I was just sitting and watching Jesse play Blitz. So if there's a lot of booms and snaps and stuff today, what can you do, right? Sorry, and I'm messing up as well. So knight a4 hits the queen and the knight. White doesn't take it. They move the queen back. And it is black who initiates the snip-snop. And then pop. Snips him here. Queen comes out. White did not take the rook. What did they do? I think well-intentionedly they tried to now develop this bishop. Yep, that seems right. And now, boom! Another explosive move from Bobby. I pre-peppered this game with little like exclams and marks so they would pop up like this on the chess.com board. Here, but we're about to get more exclams. Maybe I gave this one 2. We'll see. Whoops, sorry. Out of order, Pruess. Oh, man, what are you doing? All right. Gives a check first, of course. Hits the king. King over here. Now, I was just excited about the deluge of exclams. Now we come here. There you go. Double right there. This needs to be check for us to sack the queen. Takes the queen. Yum. Oh, the windmill. Basically everybody's favorite mechanism. He goes all that way just to eat the D pawn, comes back to where he started, and then snips this guy over here. Queen gets it. King gets out of here. Now it gets hard to remember. Well, I know they traded these pieces. Now it starts to get hard to remember the moves. Again here. Whoops. And I got one wrong again. Check first. Every time I say something, I lose my focus on the moves. maybe a little tip there for all of you when you work on memorizing this. You're going to have to pay some attention to what you're doing when you do so. All right, blocks, recaptures, bishop here. Knight's going to come out anyway. Backs up. Hits the pawn. It goes here, pushes here, blocks him there. Knight e5. Get ready. He runs. Okay, now check. Here. I previously made this mistake once when replaying this game, but there's the knight on that square. So it's the barrage of checks goes this way, this way. We'll see if I get this right. This way, yep. Now the knight can come back. All right. So that's the game. Now, what I want to say is the first 5 moves of the opening to get here are a little bit tricky to remember what order they came in, because there's a lot of different move orders you could get here. Like, you could have started with d4, knight f6, c4, g6, right? You could have started with c4, g6. In this game, they started with knight f3. To some extent, if you can remember this position at move 5, you don't need to know the move order that got to it, in my opinion. So if you can think of this as, bishop f4 variation of the Grunfeld, I don't know if it's got a better name to it, but, bishop f4 Grunfeld, I think that'll be enough to, get you into the game and then get you through it. So that's one part that's going to be hard. And for me, the second part that's really hard is after this, where I wrote the rest requires no comment. It's super easily winning. For me, once it's really obvious who is winning a game, there's sort of like a tension that drops out of the game, and it can be hard to tell what moves were played because you've got 10 different moves that lead to the same kind of result. I mean, the next one move is still easy, right? Because until we take the rook, it's that much is clear. But then in this position here, he's got a rook and a bishop pair and a pawn against the queen. And on top of that, as you saw in the next 2 moves, he picks up these 2 pawns, right? So the material advantage is like +7 in the old, count pawns kind of way. It's just so extreme that it's kind of silly. And so I would kind of say, if you don't memorize the game after this point, and this is probably not sanctioned by Jesse and Kostya, it might get me in trouble. But if you don't memorize all the last moves after this, it's not that critical, really, to memorize all of them. I mean, there's kind of like a nice use of the pieces by Fischer. I mean, he plays all the moves nicely, so it's not bad to learn the moves, but it's a little bit hard to do. So anyway, I mean, you should try, right? It's an exercise, why not? And it allows you to then show the game in a more fulfilling and complete way to other people. And one of the great things about memorizing a few great games of chess is that you just have it in your back brain pocket or whatever, so that when you're hanging out with other chess people, you can pull them out and show them, right? Like when you were a kid and you had a rock that you'd found in a yard, and you could pull it out and show somebody else, oh, I found this rock. So it's really great to have these games, and it's more satisfying to show the game if you can actually show it, and the more of it you can show, the more it seems complete. So if you get confused about the move order, you've got to be able to at least get to some position that is in the game, so you can show the game from that point forward, right? And after this, you'd better really know what's happening, because captures start happening. So got to have these 5 moves, got to have some way to get to these 5 moves, and the more you can show at the end, the more satisfying it'll be for people. But honestly, if you stopped around, the point where Bobby's up a bunch of material, people would have seen the real juice of the game, which is that phase between moves 10 and 25 where it's super tactical and he sacks a bunch of pieces. Some of them are not taken but offered, when there's a bunch of sacrifices and exclams. That's really the exciting part of the game that'll get you a lot of oohs and ahs. And it's also stuff not only you can share with chess friends, but you can share with non-chess people as a way to entice them. People who sort of know the rules but don't get why chess is so cool. You can show them games like this to sort of wake them up. And that's something that I and other chess teachers will sometimes do if you're giving like public classes or whatever, and the average rating in the room might be 200 or 300, but you show them one of the most brilliant games of chess history. In a certain sense, they can't appreciate it. They can't calculate variations like Bobby Fischer or Garry Kasparov or, whatever other great historical player or a modern player, some great game of Magnus's against Ferrugia or something. So no, they can't really understand the game, but there can still be things in those great games that are sensational and thrilling just to see them for a moment, even without understanding, where you sort of notice, like, if you see a pawn, going through the enemy camp and queening and it's surrounded by enemy pieces, or if you see somebody sacrifice their queen and then win, or you see somebody sack a bunch of pieces and give checkmate with their last one or two pieces, people can still see, like, wow, it defies, our sense of materialism, or it defies our sense of time, or it defies our sense of who's big and who's small. And so, people will get some kind of aesthetic hit out of these games anyway, and so they're a very good thing, actually, to show to total novices. Don't burden them down with too many variations they won't understand, and I will try not to as well, but, just a little tip out there to bring in some more people. So now let's go through the game. So it's hard for me to remember the first 5 moves as well. So I tell myself it started with knight f3, knight f6, and that Byrne used a move order that can be used to avoid the Grunfeld. But then Fischer didn't play the Grunfeld. So it's like a weird move order, kind of like back and forth. But the weirder it is, the better it stands out in my memory as a little story that I can tell myself, right? So Byrne played a move order that's famous for trying to avoid the Grunfeld, and it's to hold back the move d4, right? You play knight c3, bishop g7, and then you can play the move e4 right here, and you force black into a King's Indian after they go d6 and you go d4. So he plays this move order with knight f3, c4, knight c3 that's to sort of avoid the main Grunfeld. A super determined Grunfeld player might sometimes play d5 in this position, but it's quite it's a little bit different. I don't know if I should say quite different. It's a little bit different. So this is an anti-Grunfeld move order, and then when Fischer plays bishop g7, he then doesn't avoid the Grunfeld and instead walks straight back into it. I don't know why, but that's the weird story of it, right? So he plays the anti-Grunfeld move order, then he allows the Grunfeld. Fischer declines the Grunfeld, allowing e4, d6 with the King's Indian, and only after he sees bishop f4 does he say, hey, against bishop f4, I like the Grunfeld here. I'll just say against bishop f4, I also like the King's Indian here, right? That's reasonably logical, whereas d5, it looks like the bishop's in the game. So the move order for the first 5 moves, to me, is more or less nonsensical, and I try and remember it in terms of, like, wow, that's nonsensical. Whether that will work for you, I can't guarantee. But we get a bishop f4 Grunfeld. The more you repeat it and the more you talk about it, the more you might be able to remember it anyway. And now he does something which, to my mind, is odd, Byrne. He plays queen b3, mixing sort of like the queen b3 Grunfeld with the bishop f4 Grunfeld. I think queen b3 is called the Russian variation. I don't know much about it, but bishop f4 is strangely committal within the Russian variation, which generally has, d takes c4, queen on c4. This is like typical for it. And you'll see he rearranges this bishop within 3 moves. So it's a little bit weird, but he does get, the hit on c7. So I don't know how much it cost him. Really, I don't know if this line is good or bad on its own. But I would expect a bishop f4 player to probably just play like e3, supporting d4 against the bishop and, preparing to develop this bishop. I think then something like c5 might be Grunfeld main lines, but anyway, Byrne played queen b3, sort of mixing these two systems, hits c7. Because c7's attacked, we know that this is where you need to pay the little sort of mild tribute tempo with c6, which is not a useless move anyway. It keeps this pawn from advancing, and it lets the queen move. Here, where you sometimes have counterplay when the bishop comes out early from white without quick castling. In e4 openings, this is rarely a big deal, but in some d4 openings where you develop your whole queen side before getting castled, this kind of stuff can come up, and or queen b6 as well, hitting b2. So this game is such a case, right, where white's going to play rook d1 before castling. So he plays c6 to avoid the c7 thing, and after e4, he's going to bring this knight to b6. So that maneuver begins. Knight here, rook d1. Restraining moves like e5 and c5, but to my mind, a little bit fancy, where I would want to be developing this bishop myself. So he goes rook d1. It's nothing immediately punishable. Knight b6, and puts the queen here. Not queen back to b3. And I don't know why for sure, but I mean, maybe he doesn't like bishop e6, maybe he doesn't like a5, a4, a3, which is a plan for black, and the Grunfeld as well. Or maybe he just really liked queen c5 for some reason. It's an unusual square to see the queen on in this opening. You can remember that he brought the queen to c5 because Bobby usually afterwards uses this knight a4 tactic, right, hitting the knight and queen, and that's coming up pretty soon, so you can remember that the queen went to this slightly weird square. And now Fischer finishes development, and with a nice move, the most aggressive square for that piece, threatening to double pawns if white castle's there, or to take the rook if the knight moves, and sort of taking the knight out of the game in this fight over d4 and e5. And now white plays basically the lemon of the game, which is moving this piece a second time, repositioning it like this. To me, the obvious move is bishop e2, and I don't think I see anything special going on. I think it's about equal. I may or may not have computer checked this at some point, and the computer agreed with me that it was equal, or maybe I didn't computer check it, and I have no idea. But if I did computer check it, the computer didn't tell me I was wrong, because I didn't edit anything about what I said about this. I feel like it's equal, more or less. And anyway, he pays severely for this move, but it's also a move which I would struggle to explain to you because, I mean, normally when you move a piece a second time, you've got a fairly strong reason for it, and here I can't see the reason for it. The bishop's on a fine square-ish, it's helping to stop e5. It could go to e5 itself to trade this bishop or reduce pressure against d4. I don't see what it does extra on g5. And also, black wants to do this, and where are you planning to put your king? It's hard. It's hard to see a one-move threat from black, and white could deal with the one-move threat by developing their last piece and just completely ignores it. It's, I don't know. It's super confusing to me. And, yeah, I mean, against any move for black, I would think this move wouldn't make sense. But Fischer punishes it ever so severely. Yeah. So now cascade of forcing moves gets started. He kicks things off with knight a4, which is an insane geometry around this poor queen on c5 that you rarely see, and this stupid bishop move, which is knight a4 hitting the queen and knight. And okay, if the queen moves, he's going to trade the knight on c3, so he's weakening the e4 square, right? And if the knight takes, of course, he's going for e4 as well. And now it's hitting the bishop and the queen. And if the queen goes to the wrong square, you could have bishop takes f3 and recapture the bishop. And then you'd be up a pawn because you grabbed a pawn on e4. But if the queen goes to the wrong square, the move queen a5 check could also win this piece or this piece. Okay, so this position I analyzed a tiny little bit, and I don't want to bog you down with too many variations. So I'll just briefly give you something on queen e7 and queen c1, just to give you an idea, right? So if the queen tries to keep this bishop defended, she can come back to c1. And then I calculated bishop takes f3, hitting the rook. Pawn takes f3, queen a5 check, threatening the bishop. And black wins back the piece. Plus they're already up a pawn, plus white's pawn structure is demolished, right? So in this position, it would be something like bishop d2 to save the bishop. Black's going to trade off the knight that's attacked by a pawn, and then when white recaptures, black's going to take here. So looking at this position, you can see black's up a pawn, d4's weak, the whole king side's weak, white's not developed, the king position's going to be weak. Blech, completely lost. Okay, so that's one branch with knight e4. The other move that's more complicated is queen e7. There may be multiple ways to win here. Yeah, I think I analyzed 3 variations, I think, and they were all good. So how do I pick which one I think is best? I only want to show you one of them, not all 10. All right, I'll go queen a5 check, hitting pieces. And then if the knight retreats, black has rook e8, hitting the queen, and wherever she goes, this knight can then go on a rampage, right? Because it'll be check against the king. The knight could take the bishop, the knight could take the knight, and then the rook, or the bishop and then the knight. So it's just going to be the end there. It's because rook e8 is such a huge threat here. White has to go b4. Black takes the piece. And now we've reestablished material equality at the moment. First, we sacked a knight. We got a pawn. Then white got a pawn, and we got back a knight. If white takes the knight on e4, then rook e8 is going to be strong. If white doesn't take the knight on e4, then what are they playing for? Their position's a mess, right? a2, b4, d4 all weak. Bishop f3, rook e8. They're not developed. It's just, yeah, there's nothing really to do. And the trickiest variation I found was queen e4, rook e8, like bishop e7 to block. You can't block with the knight here. So like bishop e7, and then I take. The queen still needs to keep the bishop defended. G takes here. And we win back our piece. And again, resulting position is crushing. Nominally material equality, but every white pawn is weak, and their king is going to be weak wherever it goes because there's nowhere with good pawns for the king to go behind, which is actually a very interesting positional factor in general in chess just to know about. Is like if you can ever generate a position where there's literally no place on the board with a good pawn cover, then you know your opponent's king is going to be weak through the whole game until queens are traded. So you can try and keep queens on the board and in general keep pieces on the board and just keep maneuvering around and know that eventually you'll be able to generate an attack. You don't have to, pressingly chase the king. You can eventually come around to him because he's not really going anywhere. So that was if white took the knight on e4, on a4, and allowed knight takes e4. And yeah, there's no holding this together. I mean, I guess I didn't show you a move like queen b4 stopping queen a5, and then I guess a simple variation. I was going to say simple variation, bishop f3 and knight g5, but there is bishop takes e7. So maybe here it would be simpler to take. Now the king's in the middle of the board. There's 2 knights against a rook and 2 pawns, right? Because this pawn's hanging. And we can go e5 or bishop takes d4. Right? 2 pawns and a rook against 2 knights, plus this is hanging, the king's in danger, etc. Something like that could be pretty easy. Okay. Sorry for extra variations. So knight a4 was played here, and white retreated the queen to a3. How do you know where white retreated the queen? Well, there's not a lot of squares to go to, first of all. And it's just the queen gets to the furthest away square it can get from other black pieces pursuing it while defending b2 and c3. Bobby trades off the knight because the point is to weaken this square, right? Pawn takes, and then he just takes the pawn. That was the point of knight a4, so hopefully it's all linked. Like knight a4 is to play knight e4. So when white declines taking the knight, he's still just going to trade off the knight on c3 and then take on e4. Now, at this point, white would be down a pawn for nothing if they retreated the bishop, right? Plus undeveloped and whatever more initiative Fischer can continue to hit white with before they finish development. So Byrne's idea was bishop takes e7, and you'll see people play a move like this basically every time when they're in a position that's starting to feel like completely lost, is they'll play the move that has some chance of staying in the game, right? Like they'll try to stay even on material rather than just give up material and try and hunker down. You'll generally see people trying to keep the game within range where if you make a mistake, they could still save the game. Whereas if you're just down lots of material and getting chased around, then even if your opponent makes a mistake, you're still losing. They don't have to chase your king down or play any precise moves because they also have the material advantage. So he goes bishop e7, attacking the queen and rook and equalizing pawns. Bobby moves the queen away to the most aggressive square available, not queen a5 because it would be taken. So queen b6. And here I said that Byrne finally played a well-intentioned move here, trying to catch up on development and get castled, and almost makes it, but doesn't. If he took here, then the intention, I think, for Fischer is to recapture with the bishop to have a tempo. And the best move I found for white, this is a variation, not the game, right? The best move I found for white is you move the queen while trying to maybe keep this defended and offer a queen trade to alleviate the pressure. But in this position, I think the point of bishop f8 is to be able to take on c3 when the queen can't recapture. Bishop b4. So knight takes c3, hitting the rook, and allowing the queen trade. But I think even after the queen trade, white's busted, so I played rook a1, defending a2 against rook coming in. So this position here, if you look at it, black has one pawn and a bishop against this rook. So it's not a huge sacrifice at the moment, and there are a couple ways for black to win back a pawn. For example, a2 is undefended, or you could trade on f3 and then attack the d pawn, and no one will be able to defend it. If you win back a second pawn, material will basically be equal. So I use this position actually as a calculation exercise for myself. I set it up, I calculated for a while, and just tried to find the best continuation I could find for black. It's a really cool exercise. You know, if for some reason anyone over 1800 is watching this video, I would recommend it for you here as a really good exercise. Give yourself maybe 15 minutes on it and just try and pick what move you would play for black and write down, the variation that justifies it, and maybe some of the variations that you considered as alternatives and why you didn't pick them or how good or bad you thought they were. And then you can check afterwards with a computer or a friend, or just moving all the pieces yourself, how well you did on the exercise. But I'll just tell you guys, I found that black is good enough here that Bobby is justified to be giving this exchange. He's easily comfortable in the final position. But I won't say how big the advantage is because it would spoil the video for folks. But let's just say black had the advantage ever since he played knight a4 because bishop g5 was a mistake. Or more precisely, he's had the advantage ever since white played bishop g5. Okay, so white develops. Now, important, right? I think he continues the path of savagery by just going knight takes c3. But let's just double check that for a second. Could he have played rook e8 here? Sort of getting his eyes on the bishop and preparing knight takes c3. Perhaps, yes. Perhaps rook e8. It looks like it would also be playable here. The question with rook e8 would be, is there any kind of bishop f7 trick? I think that's what white was maybe hoping for as well with bishop c4. But honestly, I don't see how bishop f7 would work against rook e8 here. All that be as it may, I know he played knight takes c3 here first. With an immediate threat on the rook, it doesn't give a lot of choices for white. White basically has to take the knight or take the rook or retreat while hitting the queen. And that's the move that was played in the game, bishop c5, trying to chase the queen away and give him the freedom to eat this knight next. Because had he taken the knight, Fischer would have put either rook on e8, and then you castle and he takes. Black's a pawn up for nothing, The bishop pair looks fine. The d4 pawn's a little bit weak. So if anything, black's up, a pawn plus, a pawn and change. Okay, so that's the option of taking it. So bishop c5, the idea is if you retreat your queen, he's going to be able to take the knight, and then rook e8 won't win that bishop because it got off the file with tempo. And so he'll be able to play king f1 or retreat the bishop to block something like that. Well, black did throw in the check. So we got exactly that kind of position he had in mind, where he's going to be able to take the knight if Bobby's queen retreats. But real quick, I'll just show you that if he took here, black would take back with the bishop, tempoing the queen again. She can't take the knight because of bishop b4 winning her. And if she doesn't take the knight, then the knight will take the rook after the queen moves. And so black will be winning again, right? They've recovered all their material. They're up a pawn with a better position. So bishop c5, and here Fischer gave the check. The king had only this square here. If king goes to d2, I don't know if there's much better, fancier moves, but at least knight e4 check, saving the knight and then taking the bishop is going to be winning for black. I guess one other cool line was that if you block with the knight, black can take with the bishop, leaving the queen hanging one more move. If d5, rook check, and you lose everything. The bishop's hanging, and if it goes here, black takes it anyway, like so. And if you take the queen here, then simply bishop check. The king marches around, and black recaptures with an extra knight, plus white stuff is all hanging. So on rook e8 check, the king went to f1, the only place to go. And now, right, now this is Byrne's big idea. If the queen retreats, he takes the knight. And, he's in business. He's in fine shape. He's going to have to work out the king situation, but he's up a piece against one pawn. So it's worth the trouble. But here Fischer played this amazing move, bishop e6, with a counterattack against white's hanging bishop on c4. And suddenly, white's king position falls apart, kind of by surprise. Like, it looked awkward a moment ago, but you wouldn't necessarily guess that it was dead. But here are the variations. You can take the bishop or you can take the queen. Pretty much, right? Because black's threatening to take this with check. Or you could take the knight. I also calculated that. So if you take the bishop, then it's queen check, and the bishop doesn't have c4 defended, so it can't get back to defend this diagonal. If the king comes out, there's mate on e2. So black gives a famous Philidor legacy checkmate, right? Still king e1, queen e2, king g1, check, here. It's rather beautiful because black only has the knight on this side of the board, right? Playing against white's entire army. 2 rooks trapping the king in instead of 1. It's a very, very nice Philidor's legacy. So that's bishop takes e6. Bishop b6 is in the game, so I'll just show you queen c3 real quick. I think black simply takes this bishop because the queen's undefended. So now c4 is hanging really badly and it can't move because of queen takes queen, so white has to take the queen. Black takes, and we probably trade. And black's got a pawn up endgame. Plus white needs to spend a couple tempi to get this rook out of h1, right? You see I've already got my arrows and highlights in place here. g3, king g2, and the rook on h1 can finally get out. Probably losing, right, to be down a pawn and have that work to do, but not 100% guaranteed, just on the borderline of lost. So that said, the move in the game was he accepted the queen. But as you've seen, Fischer's going to collect gobs of material for this first one bishop. Remember, he needs to collect this d4 pawn, but that's the only thing he can get out of this windmill. Right? And then he just brings the knight back to where it was, so it'll be attacking the rook. In this position here, if he didn't play the windmill and just took this bishop over here, hitting the queen, hoping to take the rook next move with the knight, white has queen takes knight. See, you're blocked by this pawn. And now black's lost. They've got one bishop against the queen, and they're doing absolutely nothing. So this windmill only gains a single pawn, yet it's absolutely critical. Note the king can't come out. It still has to go back. It's not worth going and taking this rook or anything like that. This rook's not good. Plus, this knight will be able to collect this rook later, but we want to be in position, defended here, to take this. And the more your pieces are defended, the less likely your opponent has a tactical save when you're attacking 2 pieces. So here we're attacking 2 pieces, right? Double threats in chess are very strong, but they're not always decisive. Sometimes someone saves one piece while defending the other. Sometimes they counterattack something. And the best way to get out of a double attack, honestly, or a double or triple threat, is to move one of the pieces that's been threatened and create a new threat of your own. So you have to be careful when you're going for winning tactics of how many undefended pieces you have yourself. Is your opponent going to be able to tag them to slip out of things? And that's what white tries here, is queen b4, trying to tag the only undefended piece black has. And Fischer had properly had his eye on this, and properly saw that with the move rook a4, he can protect the bishop. And that's it. Now all the pieces are sort of linked in defense, except for the rook on e8, and the queen can't get to it, and the rook drops. The one other thing you could try to do would be to try and recapture here, like queen c1. If black takes, you could recapture, or you could have seen, oh, the undefended piece is there, and we take through there, right? That would have led to a very, very close endgame, because black would have had rook, bishop, and a couple pawns against the queen. So it would have been really close, not obvious who would have the advantage. But the thing is, the queen doesn't actually have access to the c1 square, because there's still this knight e2 check. So she couldn't come back here and defend the rook and look at that bishop askance, because knight check, and now, oh my goodness, now we're windmilling again, right? Back into the windmill. You don't want to get windmilled twice in one game, right? Ooh. So the queen went to b4. Fischer attacked her. Everybody's defended. She grabbed one pawn and he took the rook. And this is where I said, whatever, it's winning. To know what happens here, the next thing white does is play h3, king h2 to get the rook out, sort of completing development. And Fischer just, improves the rook while capturing things. Eventually you want to break through these 2 points to attack the king and checkmate it. King moves here. He takes with the knight, because the knight was attacked, right? So he takes with the knight. And it attacks the rook. So this is where white's rook comes out and trades rooks. And after takes, this is where it can be automatic to recapture. And this is where white threw in queen d8. It's a little Zwischenzug to keep the bishop tied up. Had white played here with the knight just recapturing, then I imagine bishop e5 check would have been strong for Fischer, kind of putting the king back into a weak back rank situation. And in this position, I don't know what's stronger, knight e4 or rook e2 or some other move, but the king is now in sort of a back rank trap, which is not ideal for him. So in this position, instead of just the recapture, white gives the check, which restrains this bishop for a little while, and then recaptures. And that means that it's going to be just a little bit slower for black to give checkmate, because it's rook, bishop, and knight, attacking a knight against a knight and a pawn. Not quite enough to fully break through. But, first you're going to aim at g2 with the bishop, and then you're going to move the knight. White played knight f3. He played knight e4. I think next he would probably play king g7, but there's a number of things he could do. He could move the b pawn. You see, once it gets to b5, there's b4 is defended, b3 is defended, b2 is defended. So just starting to push the b pawn, that could probably win the game pretty easily. And the other plan would be something like in the game, king g7 to bring the bishop out and go for the checkmating attack. White played here, queen b8 attacking the pawn. Bobby saved the pawn. He could also just ignore it, play king here, and then give checkmate if white took the pawn. But as I said, it's just white threatens to take it. You just defend it, and you can queen it as well. So why not have that as another guaranteed way to win the game? Now white played h4, h5. Maybe if black paid no attention, the pawn could go to h6, and then the king can't untangle the bishop. Maybe some kind of hopes. But h5 stopping that immediately. Knight e5 with a threat of knight d7. Black wanted to unpin here anyway, so the king moves out of the way. Now we've got the bishop d6 threat, so the king gets off of that diagonal. Gets off. And now it's checks. Note that there's no bishop c4, knight c4. It's going to be checkmate all with checks here, so just look for checks and find them. Knight d2 instead would be discoordinating because it blocks your rook and maybe gives the king some new flight squares. I'm sure you could checkmate anyway, but you'd have to back up basically on the very next move. After king up, you just have to go back to e4. So knight g3 is correct. King comes this way, and now you just roll him with the bishops. The knight's not far enough to control this square, so just keep rolling him. Now, you can't checkmate with here, here, here. Not quite enough. You could play a move like bishop c3, and the king's trapped and dead to rook a1 if you don't want to do everything with check, but he does everything with check. Gives the knight check, king here, knight back, king here, and rook here. And this is like a nice pattern to know. I found it to be one of the most common mating patterns in endgames. You can do it with the pawn instead of a bishop. More often you don't have like an extra bishop pair than your opponent, so you've got like a pawn defending that square, and that's enough. The pawn is enough for the rook and knight to start setting up certain mating threats or combinations where the pawn pushes through in queens. So this is a nice enough pattern to know, or sufficiently useful pattern that I recommend knowing it. And that's the game of the century, folks. Really cool game. Very exciting. And what it highlights is how one little misstep, how he seizes the initiative and just punishes. The degree to which that punishment is nonstop. You know, how well he uses the initiative, how hotly he pursues white is really something to behold. Story of the game. White uses a move order to avoid the Grunfeld. Fischer accepts to play the King's Indian. Then White accepts to play the Grunfeld. Then Fischer accepts to play the King's Indian. Then finally, he does play the Grunfeld. We get a bishop f4, Grunfeld into queen b3, queen takes c4 like a Russian variation. Fischer finishes developing the pieces, and White plays some fancy moves with rook d1 and bishop g5 instead of playing bishop e2 and castles. And having not played bishop e2 and castles, Fischer then unleashes against White, starting with the knight a4 shot, knight takes e4 shot, bishop takes e7, attacking the queen and rook. He just brings out the queen, leaves the rook hanging. His queen gets attacked. In between, he plays knight takes c3, sacking the knight on c3. White doesn't take it, but attacks his queen. Then he leaves the queen hanging, goes rook e8 check, bishop e6, the move of the century in the game of the century. Windmills White for a bit, collects a bunch of pieces for that queen sack, and then chases the king down with the mob of pieces in the endgame for an actual checkmate. It's kind of the story. You can see if you could sort of follow it along there without me moving the pieces. That's kind of a third stage. So as usual, play over the game a couple times, think about some of the moves, go show it to a friend, go show it to another friend, and hopefully this one will stick with you. And you'll be able to carry the lessons from this game mainly about the initiative and the tactical possibilities that lie within a position, because it's not so obvious that White's position is ripe for destruction. When we look at this position here, there's not so much stuff hanging, but it's that it takes 2 moves to castle, not 1, so White can't just bail out on a moment's notice. And then the e4 pawn being sensitive, and Black just turns that into like one threat after the next. So Grandmaster class in using the initiative. Have a good day, everybody. Take care. See you for the next videos later here on ChessDojo.